Afternoon or evening, whenever you're able to watch this video, and it's great to be together and to look at one of our first sort of thematic looks of Proverbs, and that's the issue or topic of work in the book of Proverbs. It's quite a rich part of Proverbs, and it actually has a lot to say about work, and I would encourage you between now and the end of this Bible study journey we're going to have in Proverbs is just to read Proverbs 10 to 31 and really delve into this idea of work and all the other subjects Proverbs covers. But just as we start journeying through Proverbs 10 to 31, and we're going to look at it thematically, there's a couple of things we just have to keep in mind all the time when we do it, that we don't lose the big picture. And the first thing is we always need to keep in mind the voice of wisdom and folly, which is described in Proverbs 1 to 9. It says, it's interesting that Proverbs 10, verse 1, the beginning of this section, begins with, "A wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son grief to his mother," which links back to Proverbs 1:8, which asks the son to listen to his father's teaching and his mom's instruction, and Proverbs 9, 1 to 18, where both wisdom and folly are calling out to the son. And we need to keep in mind that Proverbs 1 to 9 is all the prep work so that we can enjoy and understand and really appreciate chapters 10 to 31. It's similar to Deuteronomy 6 to 11, where Moses really appeals to Israel to love God, to fear the Lord. It's only once he's done this extensive appeal that he then moves in chapter 12 to give the commands. And so in a similar way, Proverbs is structured that way. And I would argue it's very important that we keep the middle section of this dialogue in context and at the back of our mind, which is Proverbs 3, verse 1 to 10, where the fear of the Lord, trusting the Lord, acknowledging Him in our ways, worshipping Him is central and is actually the central path to wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But also when you read Proverbs 10 to 31, it's important to notice that it does have a haphazard nature. And the reason for that, and that's even what some commentators say, you can see it in the notes, it reflects life. Life is like that. And so Proverbs is structured like that. It's very comprehensive. You won't always find a neat structure in these proverbial sayings, but that's okay. And you'll find one chapter might cover a varied amount of different topics. And the reason for that is it reflects life. You every day encounter relationships, speech, work, you name it. And Proverbs is structured just like life is structured in many ways. But there is a flow, and the flow you will notice, it's a general flow, is Proverbs starts with the simple and young. You can see that in Proverbs 1:4, verse 8, chapter 9, verse 4, chapter 10, verse 1, which starts. But interestingly, the whole book of Proverbs ends with the wise women. And when you look at the wise women and you look at the sayings, you will see that the wise woman is really the complete package. This is a person who has listened to wisdom in Proverbs 1 to 9 and has embraced and applied the sayings in Proverbs 10 to 31, and she is really the complete picture. This is how it looks like, a life impacted by wisdom, from being simple and young to being this wise woman who is praised at the city gates. So we need to keep that context in mind when we look at the sayings. But as we begin, Proverbs actually begins with the idea of work, which is quite interesting. And this part of the saying starts off with a neat little composite unit of 5 verses in chapter 10, verse 1 to 5. And I just wanted to show you, it sort of highlights all the things we've learned in the voice of wisdom and folly, but also brings in the idea of work here. And it's nicely divided in many ways. It starts off in verse 1 with a general contrasting statement, which we've already observed. A wise son brings joy, a foolish son brings grief, which links with Proverbs 1:8. And there's the contrast. What follows is a second part, B, if I can put it that way, which is a contrasting statement, which explores this idea of the wise and foolish son. So ill-gotten treasure equals worthlessness, or it's worthless, while righteousness equals deliverance from death. And you need to remember the sayings in Proverbs 1 to 10 of basically that gang band which took ill-gotten treasure. They thieve and steal. And there it says actually they're only plotting their own end. While in Proverbs chapter 3 verse 1 to 35 we see the way of righteousness, which is fearing God, acknowledging in our ways, doing good to our neighbor, loving our neighbor, loving God, loving our neighbor. That's the righteousness being described here. And it says that's the two contrary. A wise son will be in righteousness, a foolish son will move the way of ill-gotten treasure. But then a similar contrasting statement is made here in verse 4, which lazy hands will bring poverty, while diligent hands brings wealth. A wise son will be diligent, a foolish son will be lazy. But then we also see another contrasting statement, bringing back the terminology of a wise son on purpose and a disgraceful son. We see a wise son will be timely in his work, he will do it at the proper time, while a foolish son, he'll just sleep. He'll be lazy. But in the middle of it is verse 3. Why is this all true? Why is this the case? Righteousness, deliverance from death. Why is it the case? Blessing for a wise son or wealth for a wise son. It's a theological reason. It's the Lord. The Lord satisfies the hunger of the righteous, but thwarts the hunger and craving of the wicked. You see that in verse 3. It's been a theme actually throughout the book of Proverbs. And actually it's a theme in Deuteronomy, Genesis, the prophets. It's this theological statement which drives the idea of work, and we need to keep that in mind. But Proverbs has a lot to say about work, and here's just a snapshot of it. I know there's way more to it, but just to give you an idea how comprehensive Proverbs is, and you'll explore it as groups, is like, for example, Proverbs 3:27-30 tells us that do not withhold good from those who deserve it. Plan harm against your neighbor. And by the way, you have to keep Proverbs 1:3-4 at the back of your mind, which says, wisdom will give you prudence, justice, equity, righteousness, all those things. And you'll notice all these sayings relate to that idea, because Proverbs 3 basically says to us, you need to love your neighbor by using what means you make from work for their good. And you plan for their good, not their harm. It's about justice. But interestingly, later on, Proverbs 11:1 says, the Lord abhors dishonest scales, but accurate weights are his delight. A similar saying is said in Proverbs 16, which highlights the idea of fair and honest trade, not to harm your business partner, but for the sake of equity, which again is a theme, or Proverbs 1:3-4. Prudence, equity is for the benefit of your business partner as well, and for liberty to flourish, freedom to flourish. That's why we do this. And interestingly, tied to this is Proverbs 11:11, which says, through the blessing of the upright, a city is exalted, which just highlights again, work, what we do in the city does impact the place where we live. We can promote liberty and equity of a city or even its destruction. But apart from those, which is about righteousness, it's quite interesting that Proverbs also gives other detailed things which does not necessarily directly relate to righteousness and justice and so forth. So, for example, Proverbs 21:17 says, he who loves pleasure will become poor. He who loves wine and oil will never be rich, which is interesting. Basically, the idea is if pleasures are pursued in life, then it will also be the vice that impoverishes us. Basically, if you live a sort of YOLO, FOMO, pursue, I want to have everything in life lifestyle, the get rich quick type of lifestyle, in the end you end up like the prodigal son, utterly destitute and poor. You'll never be wealthy. It doesn't work that way. That's not actually the way of righteousness. But Proverbs 22:29, for example, talks about skill, which is interesting. Do you see a man skilled in work? He will serve before kings. He will not serve before obscure men. Which is amazing, because it's saying as employers, we don't merely look for honest, righteous workers, but skillful ones as well. Skill is important. And as employees, skill is essential. It brings reputation. Notice the international reputation, kings, and a steady flow of work and income. It's not just your character that's important, but your skill, your gifting, and you need to develop it. But interesting as well, Proverbs also concerned about how you plan, like Proverbs 24:27. Finish your outdoor work and get your fields ready. After that, build your house. Which is interesting. It's basically saying get your priorities right. Before you build your house, which you need, you must first build the wealth that can fund it. Building a house consumes wealth, and you need actually the business or the ability to fund it. Don't put the cart before the horse. Don't go buy that massive expensive car if you actually do not have the funds or the means to do it. It's prudence, wisdom to get your priorities right. And that just gives you a little bit of a feel of how broad and sophisticated and rich Proverbs is just on this one subject about work. But of course, importantly, how does Proverbs relate to the gospel? And there's many avenues you can explore, but I just explored this idea of three things. Firstly is, because interestingly, when you look at the New Testament passages, they basically repeat what Proverbs teaches about work. The differences, I think, are these three things. It brings a fullness to it, or a fulfillment to the idea of work, which was robbed by the fall. And it says, for example, in Colossians 1-4, that as Christians, we have this new resurrection life for work. This chapter, which is about work in Colossians, or these verses, the undergirding of it is chapter 3, verse 1-4, is you have been raised with Christ. For you have died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. You have new life. He makes the same point in Colossians 2. There's this new life within you, which means unlike the person who's caught in sin and only has a sinful nature, you have been raised with Christ. You have this new resurrection life, which enables you to actually begin to live a life of work as it's supposed to be, as it's described in Proverbs. And that's why, for example, in the section about work in Colossians, it links work and worship, this fear of the Lord, saying, well, you've got this new life, which means you can actually work this way. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men. It's now part of your worship. You're not doing it for yourself anymore. You're doing it for Christ and God. And the reason so it's worship. It's part of your worship. Christ has redeemed it as a part of our worship. But also work because you got a future hope. There is, as Proverbs says, deliverance from death. There is life. Because notice the motivation. Apart from worship, verse 24, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Your work, and if you're doing it for the Lord, whatever you do, if you do it for the Lord, it is significant. Paul makes similar points in Romans, 1 Corinthians 15, you can see it in the notes. But in Christ, work is redeemed, and the work ethic we learn in Proverbs is actually possible. And I'd say that in a nutshell is what Proverbs is saying about work.